Hi, we're out on the range today, so please bear with gunfire you hear in the background. Now, today is part 3 of our 3-part series on double-action revolvers in their role as concealed carry personal protection home defense firearms. In part 1, I talked about accuracy, and in part 2, I talked about reloading. Side note, part 2 generated a lot of questions and commentary, so there's going to have to be a part 2A on reloading. But today in part 3, I want to discuss round count and capacity and the importance of those things. Now, today's presentation comes with the normal list of caveats, disclaimers, and yabbits, such as, although I'm going to do some shooting demonstration, most of what I'm going to do today is stand here and talk, and you're going to have to put up with my Shatner-esque pauses and everything else. Also remember that a lot of what I'm going to say are my observations, my conclusions, my opinions. My opinions are based on my training, my education, my experiences. Different people have different experiences, so they have different opinions. And, of course, I make no claim that my opinion has its origin in the mind of greatness. But remember, a lot of what I'm going to say today will generate some discussion and a lot of disagreement. And I would ask that before you disagree with my opinion, please remember that my opinions are based on my training, my education, and my experiences. And when you're going to disagree with me, please ask yourself, on what is your opinion based? Also remember that a lot of what I'm going to say today is going to be complex, and I'm going to be long-winded, and it's going to take me a long time to get to the point. So please, before you disagree with something I said, make sure you're disagreeing with something I really did say. Now, one other thing is that sometimes I'll say there are people of a certain opinion, or there's people who think a certain thing. And when I say that, I am not in any way claiming that I have that opinion or that I think that thing. If I were to say there's a place called New York and there are some people who live there and some people who are from there, I'm not claiming that I'm a New Yorker. I'm only pointing out that New Yorkers exist. So all that having been said, let's get started. When it comes to handguns for concealed carry, personal protection, home defense, there are people of the opinion that autoloaders are better than revolvers, and they have many reasons for that. But as it applies to round count and capacity, there are people of the opinion that autoloaders are better than revolvers because autoloaders can put more rounds downrange in less time. Now, that opinion and that belief system is based on what I call some supporting beliefs, and for some people, some of those supporting beliefs are subconscious. Now, there's a lot of supporting beliefs, but there's 3 that I've narrowed it down to that I want to discuss today. And I've created, for lack of a better term, a mathematical equation to help me illustrate that, which is A plus B plus C equals D, therefore. And I'll write down the steps of that as we go. So first, let's take a look at A. In my mathematical equation of A plus B plus C equals D, therefore, A is the belief that autos shoot faster than revolvers. Now, this comes with 3 disclaimers. The first being that I'm not talking about the first round from presentation. The first round from presentation has a whole lot more to do with carry methods and with the shooter than it does with the simplicity of revolver versus autoloader. Secondly, I'm not talking about competition guns and elite competition shooters. I'm pretty sure that Jerry Miculek can shoot a revolver faster than Jerry Seinfeld can shoot an autoloader. I'm talking about more typical guns and more typical carry methods and more typical shooters. And third, I'm not talking about anything that has to do with a reload. I mean shot number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 until your revolver runs out of ammunition. There are people who believe that those shots can be fired faster with an autoloader than with a revolver. But is this true? Let's put it to the test. When we discuss which firearm can put rounds downrange faster, I have to take a moment and recognize that yes, some citizens have successfully resolved situations even though they missed. But I'm of the opinion that it's not how fast you can put rounds downrange, but how fast you can put rounds on target that matters. So for this comparison, I'm going to use targets. Now, for a revolver, I've got my Smith & Wesson Model 29 44 Magnum. Okay, that's not bad, but how does that stack up against an autoloader? Well, for an autoloader, I've got my Ruger Mark III caliber 22 long rifle. The autoloader is the clear winner. However, right now, some people are singing that favorite song, "That Wasn't Fair." Okay, let's try 2 different handguns. So I've got two different handguns, and this time for a revolver I'm going to use the Smith & Wesson Model 63-6 caliber 22 long rifle. Okay, not bad. Now let's see how that stacks up against this Glock Model 22 in caliber 40 Smith & Wesson. And this time it would appear that the revolver was the clear winner. But again, I'm hearing people sing that song, "That's Not Fair." Well, let's take a minute to discuss that. So in our first comparison, the auto was the clear winner. In the second comparison, the revolver was the clear winner. But both of those comparisons could be described not only as unfair, but as hyperbolic or ridiculous. But they did show us a couple of things. Factors such as what calibers we're talking about, the design of those firearms, the shooter, and many other things are going to be far more important than just a simple comparison of revolver versus autoloader. So it would appear that the blanket statement that autos can shoot faster than revolvers isn't really true. So A, autos shoot faster than revolvers, we're going to call that one false. But B, autos hold more rounds than revolvers. Let's put that to the test, but this time, let's do a comparison that I consider to be more fair and realistic. Handguns can be categorized in many different ways, but for today's discussion, I'm only going to divide them into two categories: compact concealed carry type of handguns and full-size types of handguns. On the table, I've got compact concealed carry types of handguns, revolvers, and autoloaders. Now, in comparing the ammunition capacities of these handguns, I want to take just a moment and talk about rimfire handguns. This Smith & Wesson Model 63-6 caliber 22 long rifle has an 8-shot cylinder. Smith & Wesson also makes a model with a 10-shot cylinder. I've seen 22 long rifle revolvers with 12-shot cylinders. And although some people do carry rimfire handguns for concealed carry, personal protection, home defense purposes, for today's discussion I want to stick with things that I would consider more mainstream, and so I'm going to talk about centerfire handguns. So what I've got for compact concealed carry type of handguns is the Smith & Wesson Model 36-38 Special, the Smith & Wesson Model 637-38 Special, the Smith & Wesson Model 638-38 Special, and the Ruger SP-101 357 Magnum. Now for autoloaders, I've got the Smith & Wesson Bodyguard 380 ACP, the Ruger LCP-2 380 ACP, the Glock Model 42 380 ACP, the Smith & Wesson Walther PPKS 380 ACP. Now, people will ask, so let me take a minute and explain it. This handgun was made in the United States by Smith & Wesson under license from Walther. It actually has Smith & Wesson and Walther stamped on it, so it is a Smith & Wesson Walther PPKS 380 ACP. And the Sig Sauer Model 365 caliber 9x19. Now, although there are some centerfire compact revolvers with 6-shot cylinders, all of mine have 5-shot cylinders. So how does that stack up against compact autoloaders? When we talk about the capacities of autoloaders, some people will hold up a gun like this Smith & Wesson Bodyguard and say it has a capacity of 6. And that always brings up the question, does that mean a magazine capacity of 6? Or did that mean a 5-shot magazine plus the one in the chamber makes 6? And so what a lot of us will say when we're talking about the capacities of autoloaders is we'll use the phrase +1, so everybody knows that I'm talking about the one in the chamber. So the Smith & Wesson Bodyguard has a capacity of 6 + 1. The LCP-2, 6 + 1. The Glock Model 42, 6 + 1. The Smith & Wesson Walther PPKS, 7 + 1. And the Sig Sauer 365, 10 + 1. SIG also makes 12-shot magazines readily available that you can purchase for this. Now, let's take a look at some full-sized handguns. Now I have some full-sized handguns, and for revolvers I have Smith & Wesson Model 15 38 Special, Ruger Security 6 357 Magnum, Smith & Wesson Model 686 6 357 Magnum, Ruger GP 100 44 Special, and Smith & Wesson Model 29 44 Magnum. Now for autoloaders, I have my Colt Government Model 45 ACP, Beretta 92 FS 9x19, Sig Sauer M17 9x19, Glock Model 22 in caliber 40 Smith & Wesson, and FN57 5.7 by 28. Now for capacities, we've got 6, 6, 7, 5, and 6. As we're with our autoloader capacities, my Colt government model has a capacity of 7 plus 1. However, these days, a lot of times when you buy full-size 1911 platforms, they'll come with 8-shot magazines. So 7 plus 1 or 8 plus 1. For the 92FS, 15 plus 1. The M17, 17 plus 1. The Glock Model 22, 15 plus 1. And the FN57, 20 plus 1. So when you do a fair comparison, although most certainly there are some exceptions, it would appear that the great majority of the time, autoloaders do hold more rounds than revolvers. Sometimes maybe only 1 or 2 more, sometimes a lot more. So, B. Autos hold more rounds than revolvers. Again, obviously going to be some exceptions, but we're going to call that one true. And that leads us to plus C. Autos reload faster than revolvers. Now, what I really mean is autos can be reloaded faster than revolvers, but if I wrote it like that, it wouldn't all have fit on one line. This one, just like A, is going to be dependent to some degree on the shooter. I'm sure that Paul Harrell can reload a revolver faster than Paul Schaefer can reload an autoloader. But still, let's put this one to the test. Now I have my Beretta 92FS and we'll do the same drill. I'll shoot 1 shot, change magazines, shoot 1 more shot, and we'll see how long it takes from 1 shot to the next. Obviously the autoloader is faster, but right now I'm hearing that same song again of "That's Not Fair" because I reloaded before the pistol was completely empty, which really is what you should do. But just to humor the whims of the "That's Not Fair" chorus, I'll shoot till I'm completely empty and the slides lock back. The autoloader is still clearly faster. So, C in our mathematical equation, autoloaders can be reloaded faster. We're going to call that true. So A plus B plus C, even though we said A is false, it really isn't working against us. It's really neutral. A plus B plus C equals D. Autos can put more rounds downrange in less time. So, conclusion, autos are better. Is that really correct? Well, autos may very well be better than revolvers for many reasons. But is an auto better than a revolver based on these evidentiary statements? The problem is that my mathematical equation that I've made up represents a flaw in logic. Even when your evidentiary statements can be shown to be correct, or at least neutral, that doesn't necessarily mean that they support the conclusion you're drawing from them. Let me give you an example. Here's 4 facts. 1. Birds lay eggs. 2. Some birds can't fly. 3. A platypus lays eggs. 4. A platypus can't fly. So conclusion, a platypus is a bird. No, he's not. Sometimes even when your evidentiary statements are correct, they're not really supporting the conclusion you're drawing from them. So, is an autoloader better than a revolver? Yes, it certainly could be, based on a lot of things. Is an autoloader better than a revolver based on these evidentiary statements and based on its ability to put more rounds downrange in less time? Well, to answer that, we'd have to ask the question, does the ability to put more rounds downrange in less time give you an advantage? And if so, how much of one? And we'll discuss that in boring detail right after a word from our sponsor.
Mr. Fraxon, that sounds like a bad cold.
Boy, do I ache.
Watch this pain reliever comparison.
Come on, they're all the same.
Are they? Look, 2 regular tablets, 650 milligrams. These other pain relievers also, 650 milligrams, 650 milligrams. But this one is different, 800 milligrams.
Anacin has more pain reliever.
More pain reliever and a special combination of ingredients.
For my aches and fever, I'm getting Anacin.
Get the Anacin difference.
If you think that commercial was excruciating to watch now, I can assure you it was just as excruciating to watch back when it was on TV. But it helps me make a point I want to make. Back when that commercial was on television, there was a stand-up comedian who called himself Gallagher, and part of one of his acts was making fun of that commercial. And he said some things that were, of course, funny when he said them, and they won't be funny when I say them, but I think they're still valid. Such as, when you watch their stooge and you give him the choice between 650 and 800, of course he takes 800 on the basis that more must be better. And Gallagher said maybe he should ask some questions starting with, why not take two 650s and get 1300? Of course, the real math is it took 2 tablets to get 650, so the question should be, why not take 3 of those and get 975 instead of just 2 of the Anacin to get 800? But it's funnier the way he said it, and the point remains the same. Gallagher also suggested that he should ask, how much pain reliever do you really need? Maybe my body only needs 500 and 650 is plenty. No, their stooge is so stupid he just wants all the active ingredient he can get while limiting himself to only 2 pills. But those same skeptical questions are the ones we should be asking before we jump on the bandwagon of more is better in terms of capacity in your concealed carry personal protection home defense handgun. And it brings up a point where I have to put some of my opinions in this. And to the question, is more better in terms of round count, my opinion is yes, up to a point. Now let me see if I can show you something that will help illustrate that point. What I have here is a selection of shotguns, and I've done a fair amount of hunting with shotguns, and the importance of round count in hunting with shotguns can help me illustrate the importance of round count in your concealed carry personal protection home defense firearm. But before I go into that, I have to take a detour. There's a word that's getting thrown around a lot now, and there seems to be some debate over just what this word means. But one thing I can say to a high degree of certainty is that if someone calls you this, their intent is to insult you. And the word is FUD. Now again, there seems to be some debate over exactly what it means. But as near as I can tell, at least part of the meaning is that if I claim to have some knowledge or skill or information about firearms and their use, and that knowledge or skill or information comes from something I learned while hunting, then it's invalid. For example, if I were to tell someone a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with double-aught buck can be very lethal on the intended target, even at longer distances like 50 yards, and someone were to ask, well, gee, Paul, how do you know that? And I were to say, because I've shot several deer at that distance with a 12-gauge shotgun, well, then that is completely invalid. But if somebody else were to say, a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with double-aught buck can be absolutely lethal on the intended target, even at longer distances like 50 yards. Well, gee, tattooed bearded guy, how do you know that? Because I shot Jello. Well, then that's perfectly valid. And yeah, that does sound kind of dumb when I say that. I could go on the long dissertation and talk about Manfred von Richthofen and Audie Murphy and Alvin York, and the list of names goes on and on. I could go on with a long dissertation about my participation in target shooting events. And I've had a reasonable amount of success in target shooting, and I've found that when I've gone to events and I've taken first place, it's very common that the difference in score between first and second place is a factor of 1 or 2%. And it has happened a lot that when I've won, the person that finished in second place was someone who had 0 formal firearms training. Everything he ever knew about shooting came from hunting. It's also happened that I've taken second place and the person in first place was somebody who had 0 formal firearms training. So the idea that you can't learn anything about firearms and their use from hunting is, to me, preposterous. But if you are someone who is of that opinion, then I invite you to turn this presentation off now. Okay, if you're still here, then let's talk a little bit about round count and its importance while hunting with a shotgun and how that relates to the importance of round count in your personal protection concealed carry home defense firearm. Here's a single-shot shotgun, and I've done a fair amount of hunting with a single shot, and it is often adequate, but often it's not. There's been quite a few times where 2 birds have flown by, and I shoot one, and I could have easily shot the other if I'd had a shotgun that held more rounds. But the second bird was long gone by the time I could reload my single shot. It's happened to me that I've shot a rabbit, and the noise of the shot scares out another rabbit, and he was long gone by the time I could reload my single shot shotgun. Also, as much as I hate to admit, it's happened that I've missed, and whatever I was shooting at, I could have easily shot at again if I'd had more shots, but it was long gone by the time I could reload my single shot shotgun. Now, by contrast, a double-barreled shotgun, if you do the math, 2 is more than 1, has proven itself to be a great advantage. There has been many times where I've shot something, the report scared out something else, shot it. Where I've had multiple birds fly over me and I've shot multiple times. The phenomena of shooting at something with a double-barreled shotgun and missing with the first shot, but getting whatever I was shooting at with the second shot, has happened to me more times than I could even begin to count. So, having one more shot is a tremendous advantage. But when I go to a pump or autoloader where I have more than just 2 shots, how often has it occurred that having a third shot has been an advantage over 2? And it most certainly has happened. There have been times where it's taken me 3 shots to resolve whatever I was shooting at. There's been many times where a lot more than 2 ducks have flown over me, and having a third shot was a big advantage. But if this represents the number of times where having 2 shots has been an advantage over 1, then this would represent the number of times that having 3 shots has been an advantage over 2. But how many times has it occurred that I have been unable to solve a problem with 3 shots, but I have solved it with the 4th or 5th? That has happened to me exactly twice, both while deer hunting. On one occasion I had an auto-loading shotgun loaded with 5 rounds, and I had it set up so that the first 3 shots would be buckshot, and the last 2 would be slug. The thought being, if I didn't get what the deer with the first 3 shots, he's probably running away, so it'll be a longer shot. Well, the deer jumped out of the bushes and ran 40-plus yards from me. I started shooting at him with the shotgun, and it wasn't that I was missing, it's just that at that distance the pattern was big enough I wasn't hitting him with all of the pellets. By the time the deer got to be about 50 yards away, he'd really slowed down, and he just came to a stop, and he stood there looking at me, and I remembered, oh, this is my 4th shot, it's the slug, and I fired, hitting the deer, killing it. On another occasion, while on an agricultural hunt where I was actually allowed to shoot more than 1 deer, I had a pump shotgun loaded with buckshot, trying to close on the deer to get the closest shot I could. About the time I get 35 yards away, these deer start running. I shoot at one 3 times, and again, it's not that I'm missing, just not hitting it with the entire pattern. On the 3rd shot, the deer goes down. Then I swing over to another running deer, fire 2 more, that deer goes down. So I got both deer down, total of 5 shots. Now, how many times has it happened to me that I have failed to resolve whatever it was I was trying to do with 5 shots, but solved the situation with the 6th? That has happened to me exactly 0 times. So, the number of times that 2 has been an advantage over 1, the number of times that 3 has been an advantage over 2, the number of times that 4 or 5 has been an advantage over 3, and the number of times that 6 has been an advantage over 5. So we see that having more rounds in your shotgun is absolutely a plus, but we see really diminishing returns. So having a shotgun with 6 in it might be a great idea, but having shot number 7, 8, 9 might be completely superfluous. And this same kind of thing applies to round count in your concealed carry personal protection home defense handgun. Now, let me get rid of these shotguns and see if I can explain how this relates to that. So we see with our shotgun examples that having more rounds is absolutely better, but we reach a point of diminishing returns, and then we finally reach a point where your round count is such that those rounds will almost certainly be unnecessary. And that same phenomena occurs in your concealed carry personal protection home defense handgun. So the question is, where does your round count become almost certainly unnecessary? Well, to answer that, we have to ask the question, how many rounds does someone typically fire in a citizen-involved shooting? Well, for the long version of the answer to that, you can watch our presentation on gunfight statistics. But the short version is that accurate statistics as far as how many rounds someone fires to successfully resolve a citizen-involved shooting are almost impossible to get. But from what I have seen and those few sources that I consider reliable, I can say with a high degree of confidence that the great majority of citizen-involved shootings are resolved successfully with 6 rounds or less, usually less. And when more than 6 are fired, rounds 8, 10, and 12 are almost always unnecessary and sometimes legally highly questionable. Now, when I say that, there are still people who will say that high-capacity autoloaders are better than revolvers, and they will have several reasons to back that up. And there are people who will say that revolvers are better, and they'll have several reasons. And it's not really about which one is better, it's just about which one is better for you. But confining our discussion specifically to round count, there are people who will say that you should carry a high-capacity autoloader because even though 6 is sufficient most of the time, you might find yourself in that rare case where you needed more. And you should carry a high-capacity autoloader because there's no reason not to. Nobody ever complained about having too many rounds. Well, actually, there are several reasons not to, and I'll discuss 2 of those in a few minutes. But although I stand here and say that 6 rounds is going to be sufficient the great majority of the time, there most certainly are times when I am of the opinion that a high-capacity autoloader is indicated. Now, let me tell you a few anecdotes to illustrate my point, and keep in mind I'm giving you the very short versions. I was at my residence late one night when I heard a simultaneous frantic knocking on my door and frantic ringing of my doorbell. Obviously something was really wrong. I go to the front door and I see a colleague of mine being chased by an assailant who is armed with a really big, wrench. Obviously a deadly weapon. I point my pistol at the assailant, who immediately stops, backs up a few feet, and then while distracted by me, somebody else jumps him from behind. We're able to disarm him, hold him for police. If I had been forced to fire in that situation, I would have fired 2 rounds. On another occasion, and this does require a little bit more detailed version to make any sense, I went to the dry cleaner to pick up my dry cleaning, and this building is very typical of that type of business. The front of the building is almost all big windows, it's almost entirely glass. Well, I go into the building, hand my ticket to the lady behind the counter. She goes off in the back to get my dry cleaning, and as I'm standing there waiting for her, I happen to look out the front of the building, and I see a man walking down the street. He looks very average and typical. It's a public street, middle of the day, no reason to think anything is wrong. But as he's walking down the street, he suddenly stops, gives me a terribly dirty look. I hadn't said anything to him. I was inside the building. But he storms into the building. Now, he didn't look like he was ready to fight, and he didn't produce a weapon, but he walks up to me, and I'll try to get the quote correct. What he said was, to which I replied, "Oh, really?" He then added, I couldn't see that it was any kind of foreign language. Couldn't pick a single word out of it. It appeared to just be gibberish. Now, while he's saying that, of course, I'm standing there with a hand in my pocket on my pistol pointing at him. And about then, the lady comes out of the back, and she is completely at a loss to figure out what's going on here. And I said to her, "I'll keep an eye on him while you call the police." Well, this man could only speak gibberish, but he understood the word police, and that really disarmed him. He backed up and he thought about it for a second, then he stormed out of the building. I don't know. But had he been violent and had he produced a weapon and had I been forced to shoot, I would have shot 1 or 2 rounds. Now, on another occasion, I was the passenger in a vehicle being driven by one of my colleagues. We stop. He's going to go to the ATM. Now, this is at night and there aren't any people around. Now, when you get your money out of the ATM, it is a matter of courtesy that whoever's next in line will stand several feet back. Well, as my colleague is getting money out of the ATM, some guy walks up, and he walks up, stands about less than a foot behind my colleague. Okay, that doesn't look right. So I get out of the car and I walk over there about 6 feet from both of them, and I'm just standing there watching him. And he looks around and he looks at me and decides that he doesn't want to do whatever it was he had planned, and he leaves. Now, had he gone through with whatever it was he thought he was going to do, and had he put me in a position where I was forced to shoot, I would have had to shoot probably 2 rounds. Things like this are very typical of citizen-involved shootings. And that's why citizen-involved shootings are almost always resolved with 6 rounds or less. However, let me tell you another anecdote. I was with a couple of colleagues out in the middle of nowhere. I had a firearm on me. Their firearms were in a position where they weren't really accessible. And again, I'm telling you the very short version of this. For the long version of it, we have a presentation on it. But here we were when approximately 5 assailants, several hundred meters away, went behind a terrain feature and then fired 15 or 20 rounds at us. They then left. Now, we ducked for cover. We did not return fire. And it turned out to be just about as close to nothing as something could be. But what if they hadn't left? What if instead of just harassing us or saying, hey, let's see if I can hit that guy from this distance, they'd gone forward with some kind of real plan? Then in a situation like that, having a high-capacity autoloader and maybe several magazines would have been a very good thing to have. On another occasion, I was again in the middle of nowhere, where I was in no position to call for help, when I was assailed by multiple assailants with obvious evil intent, and they put me in a position where I was forced to shoot. After shooting their leader, the rest of them lost all interest in their criminal activity and fled. So the situation was resolved with 6 rounds or less. But what if they hadn't fled? Then I would have been put in a position where, in the middle of nowhere, unable to call for help, dealing with multiple adversaries, a high-capacity autoloader and maybe a few extra magazines would have been a very good thing to have. Now, just last week I went deer hunting, and I was hunting with a lever-action rifle with a capacity of 5+1, and I had 6 extra rounds for a total of 12 rounds for my rifle, which where I'm hunting is plenty. But I was by myself in the middle of nowhere, and in addition to my rifle, I had this pistol with a 15-shot magazine in my holster and 3 extra 15-shot magazines on my belt, because I was by myself in the middle of nowhere where there was no way I'm going to call for help. So even though I stand here and say revolvers in terms of round count are going to be sufficient the great majority of the time, I am of the opinion that there most certainly are occasions when a high-capacity autoloader is indicated. Now, I mentioned the 2 times where a high-capacity autoloader can work against you. One of those is if you're in a jurisdiction that has magazine restrictions. There are some places where you're limited to a 10-shot magazine. According to the sources I've seen, there's some places where you're limited to a 7-shot magazine. And if you happen to be in one of those places, I would say carry a 10-shot magazine with confidence. Guns like this can be reloaded very quickly, and 10 shots is going to be enough the great majority of the time. Also, if you're in such a place, I would advise against carrying an unauthorized magazine, because your chances of getting into legal trouble because you have a prohibited magazine greatly outweigh your chances of needing that 11th round. Now, the other occasion on which a high-capacity autoloader can work against you is a little more complicated, and I think it's best illustrated with the case of the late Laquan McDonald. Now, I have to preface this by first saying my sincere apologies if I'm pronouncing Laquan McDonald incorrectly. Secondly, this is not the format to complain about the police. There are other places that are the format for that. This is not. Laquan McDonald was armed with a knife and fleeing the police, and he was shot to death by a Chicago police officer. Now, the events that led up to that are a matter of a lot of debate. But because the shooting itself was caught on the dash cams of at least 2 police vehicles, we have a pretty good handle on what happened in terms of the shooting. Now, in doing research for today's presentation, the only video I can currently find online is the one that was filmed by the police vehicle that was behind Mr. McDonald. The one that was filmed by the vehicle that was more or less in front of him, I can't find that anymore. If someone can, please send a link to it. And what happened was, as Mr. McDonald was walking down the middle of a big street, he was fired upon by a police officer that was some distance away and oblique to his direction of travel. That police officer claimed that he was in fear for his life and that McDonald had made a threatening gesture. Now, I don't say this in jest, but the threatening gesture that he made looked kind of like some kind of disco move. He didn't even spin in the direction of the police officer. That police officer then fired, incapacitating Mr. McDonald. Now, that police officer, as far as I could tell, was armed with a Glock Model 22 and caliber 40 Smith & Wesson with a capacity of 15+1. If anybody has a source that contradicts that, please send a link to it. It is not in debate how many rounds that police officer fired. But what is a matter of some debate is how many rounds did he fire to incapacitate the suspect. Some will say that Mr. McDonald went down with the first round. Some will say it was the second or third. I'm going to interpret it as generously as I can and say that it took 4 rounds to actually put the suspect down. After Mr. McDonald was on the ground, incapacitated, virtually motionless, that police officer continued to fire at him while he was on the ground, exhausting the capacity of his 15+1 autoloader. He shot a total of 16 rounds, at least 12 of which were at someone who was immobile on the ground. The net result of that was that that police officer was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 81 months in prison. That's just short of 7 years. I'm confident that the jury took many things into account in their deliberations, such as Mr. McDonald was not traveling toward the police officer, he was some distance away, there's a debate whether his disco spin was really a threatening gesture. But one thing we can really take from this, in our discussion on round count, is that had that police officer been armed with a 6-shot revolver, that still would have been plenty to incapacitate the suspect, even if you believe the shooting was justified. I know that's a big if, but even if it was. And I would think that the jury would be more forgiving of if it took 4 rounds to incapacitate him, an extra 2 rounds of panic fire at a suspect on the ground would be more forgivable than at least 12 rounds fired at someone who is helpless on the ground. And so what we can take away from that in terms of round count is that if you are terribly untrained and prone to panic and cannot conduct yourself with anything that resembles fire discipline, then arming yourself with a handgun is probably a bad idea. And arming yourself with a high-capacity auto-loading handgun is most certainly contraindicated. So, if you've watched this entire presentation, thank you for your attention. And as always, don't try this at home on what you call a professional. And thank you for watching the Double Action Revolvers for Concealed Carry Personal Protection Home Defense video.